The emergency klaxons screamed through the Galactic Council chambers like the dying breath of 1,000 worlds. The sound was so piercing that Ambassador Thrix of the Valonian Empire actually stumbled as he burst through the massive crystalline doors, his chitinous exoskeleton clicking against the polished floor in a frantic rhythm that spoke of pure terror. "They're here!" he screamed, his four-armed form trembling as his universal translator crackled with static overload.
"The void!
Swarm has returned." You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie and the music suddenly stops? That's exactly what happened in the chamber. The constant hum of diplomatic chatter, the soft whispers of trade negotiations, the gentle clicking of data pads, all of it died in an instant. Prime Chancellor Vextar's crystalline form, normally a beautiful cascade of rainbow light, suddenly pulsed with deep red alarm patterns that bathed the entire chamber in an ominous glow. Her voice, when it came, carried the authority of someone who had governed for over 2 centuries. "Ambassador Thrix, please clarify your statement. Are you referring to the ancient enemy from the historical archives?" But before Thrix could answer, the chamber exploded into chaos. Around the circular assembly hall, representatives from 47 different species erupted into a cacophony of terror. The Drachnary delegation let out bone-chilling roars that made the air itself vibrate.
Ows!
The ethereal collective's representatives produced harmonic wails that sounded like the universe itself was crying. Even the normally stoic mechanical consciousness units were emitting distress signals that translated into rapid clicking sounds. General Korath of the Braxi Federation,
Oh.
all 9 feet of his massive frame bristling with bioarmor, slammed his claws against the marble floor hard enough to crack. Impossible," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "The Void Swarm was destroyed millennia ago. The ancient records clearly state the records were wrong." Thrix's voice broke like a teenager hitting puberty, but there was nothing funny about the raw panic in his tone. His primary hand shook as he activated the central holographic display, while his secondary arms gestured frantically at the air. The chamber fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of the grave. Every eye, sensor, and optical organ in the room focused on the holographic display that materialized above their heads. What they saw would haunt their dreams for generations to come. Entire star systems were being consumed by writhing black tendrils that moved like living smoke. But this wasn't the gentle embrace of death. This was violent, aggressive consumption. Planets that had housed billions of lives were stripped bare in minutes, their surfaces peeled away like the skin of an orange. The very stars themselves were being drained of their nuclear fire, leaving behind cold, dead husks floating in the void. 17 systems in the outer rim, Thrix whispered, his voice now barely audible. Gone, not conquered, not occupied, not even destroyed in the traditional sense. They were devoured, consumed, as if they never existed at all. The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. These weren't just random worlds, they were the frontier colonies. The early warning systems, the first line of defense against anything approaching from the galactic rim. If 17 systems had fallen this quickly, how many more were already under attack? Chancellor Vextar's light dimmed to barely a whisper, her usual commanding presence reduced to something that looked almost fragile. "Where are the Terran defense fleets?" she asked, and for the first time in her long career, her voice carried a note of desperation. Surely the humans can mount a response. Their military technology, their tactical expertise, but Thrix was already shaking his head before she finished speaking. "The humans abandoned us 3,000 years ago," he replied, his voice hollow with the weight of bitter truth. "They vanished without a trace. No warning, no explanation, no forwarding address. It's just empty worlds and ghost ships drifting in. The void like monuments to a species that simply decided to disappear." The weight of their helplessness crushed down on the assembly like a physical force. Could feel it in the air, the sudden realization that they were utterly, completely alone. Humanity, the species that had once stood as the galaxy's fiercest warriors. The ones who had earned the nickname the Terran Death Dealers for their ruthless efficiency in battle, had simply vanished into the cosmic night. But here's the thing. About humans that the galaxy had forgotten in their 3,000-year absence, they never really abandoned family. They just sometimes need to step away to become something stronger. What the Galactic Council didn't know was that somewhere in the cold depths of space, enhanced human eyes were watching, waiting, and preparing to remind the galaxy exactly why. The Void Swarm had fled in the first place. The question wasn't whether humanity would return to save them. The question was whether the galaxy would recognize what humanity had become when they did. Want to see how small actions can create massive changes over time? Just like how humanity's 3,000-year absence was actually preparation for their ultimate return. Discover the incredible power of compounding in our next video, where we'll show you how tiny, consistent efforts can transform into extraordinary results. Click the end screen now to unlock this life-changing principle that successful people use every single day in the cold depths of intergalactic space. Where the distance between galaxies stretched for millions of light years, Commander Jake Morrison stood motionless on the bridge of the starship Retribution. But calling it a bridge was like calling the Grand Canyon a small ditch. This was a command center that defied every law of physics the galaxy thought it understood. His augmented eyes, glowing with a soft blue light that had replaced his natural brown ones centuries ago, tracked the carnage unfolding in what had once been his home galaxy. The neural implants along his temples pulsed with data streams so complex that they would have instantly fried the brain of any baseline human. But Jake Morrison hadn't been baseline human for a very long time. The Void Swarm is accelerating. Their timeline, he reported to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, who stood at a tactical display that showed the real-time destruction of entire worlds. His voice carried the kind of calm authority that only came from someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall like seasons. You know how people say that war changes you? Well, imagine 3,000 years of constant warfare against entities that exist in dimensions your mind can't even comprehend. That's what had happened to humanity during their exile. Maria Santos turned from her station, her movement fluid and precise in a way that suggested her body was no longer entirely organic. Both officers wore the obsidian armor of the Terran, Shadow Cores. But this wasn't just protective gear, it was integrated into their very beings, making them living weapons that could survive in the vacuum of space as easily as breathing air. The younger races aren't ready, Maria replied, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. There was something almost sad in her tone, like a parent watching their children face a challenge they weren't prepared for. The Valonians barely have plasma weapons. The Braxi are still using chemical propulsion. It's like watching cavemen try to fight a nuclear war. But here's the thing about humans that the universe had forgotten: they never really abandoned family. They just sometimes need to step away to become strong enough to protect them. Jake's jaw tightened as he watched another world die on the tactical display. The planet had been home to 3 billion lives just moments before. Now it was nothing but floating debris and the lingering screams of a civilization that had existed for millennia, snuffed out in seconds. The Great Exodus had been humanity's hardest choice: to abandon the galaxy they'd bled for, to let the younger species grow. Without their protection, think about it. Would you leave your children to fend for themselves if you knew a terrible threat was coming? Most parents would say no. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let them grow strong on their own. Except humanity hadn't really left. They'd gone to war school, advanced war school. The kind of education that takes 3,000 years and costs everything you used to be. Commander, came a voice from the communications station. We're receiving distress signals from 47 different species. They're calling for help, but ... The officer's voice trailed off. But they're not calling for us, Jake finished. They're calling for the humans they remember. The ones who used bullets and missiles and thought 3 dimensions were all that mattered. Maria moved to stand beside him, her presence radiating a kind of controlled lethality that made the air itself seem dangerous.
The Void Swarms returned.
Was inevitable, she said quietly. We always knew they'd come back. The question was whether we'd be ready for them this time. Jake nodded, his enhanced mind processing tactical data at speeds that would make quantum computers jealous. The Void Swarm wasn't just an enemy. They were the reason humanity had voluntarily exiled themselves from the galaxy.
The last time.
They'd appeared, humanity had barely managed to drive them off, and the cost had been almost everything. This time would be different. This time, humanity wasn't just ready, they were eager. "Signal the fleet," Jake commanded, its voice carrying across the bridge with the authority of someone who had earned the right to command through blood and sacrifice.
I'll begin.
Operation Homecoming. Time to remind the galaxy what humans do to those who threaten our family. The response was immediate. Behind them, stretching across the void like a constellation of death, the vast expanse of the Terran war fleet began to move. 50,000 ships that looked nothing like the crude vessels humanity had left behind 3 millennia ago. Were predators built for hunting in the dark between worlds. Weapons that could reshape reality itself. But the most terrifying thing about the fleet wasn't its size or its technology. It was the beings who crewed it, humans who had spent 3,000 years becoming something that could make the Void Swarm afraid. Humans who had sacrificed their humanity to preserve humanity itself. As the fleet accelerated toward their home galaxy, Jake allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that wolves give to sheep just before dinner time. The younger races thought they were alone. They thought humanity had abandoned them. They had no idea that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is a parent who will do anything, become anything, to protect their children. The Void Swarm was about to learn why humanity had earned the nickname, the species that doesn't know how to quit. Want to discover how small, consistent actions can build into unstoppable force over time? Just like how humanity's 3,000-year preparation created the ultimate defensive fleet? Learn the incredible power of compounding in our next video where we'll show you how tiny daily habits can transform into extraordinary results. Click the end screen now to unlock this life-changing principle that turns ordinary people into legends. The first sign wasn't ships appearing on sensors. It wasn't the familiar blue-white flash of hyperspace exits or the gravitational distortions. That usually announced an incoming fleet. No, the first sign that humanity had returned was something far more terrifying. The Void Swarm's advanced fleet suddenly convulsing in agony. Picture this. You're watching what you think is an unstoppable force of nature, something that has been methodically devouring entire star systems for weeks. And suddenly, it starts screaming. Not metaphorically screaming, actually screaming across every frequency of the electromagnetic spectrum. The biomechanical forms of the swarm dreadnoughts began writhing in space like dying whales. Their massive tentacles that had been stripping planets bare now turning inward with surgical precision. These creatures, each the size of a small moon, started cannibalizing themselves as if something had hijacked their nervous systems and turned their own bodies into weapons against them. On the bridge of the Valonian command ship, Persistence, Admiral Threx stood frozen at his command station, all 4 of his eyes wide with disbelief. His chitinous fingers, normally steady from decades of military service, trembled as he gripped the tactical display controls. The bridge crew around him had gone completely silent, their usual efficient chatter replaced by the kind of stunned quiet that follows a lightning strike. "Sir," his communications officer stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, "we're receiving a transmission. It's in the old human tongue. You know that feeling when you hear a song from your childhood that you thought you'd forgotten?" That's what ran through the bridge crew as they heard the ancient Earth language that hadn't been spoken in their space for 3,000 years. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was something far more primal. The main view screen flickered too. Life with the kind of static that suggested the signal was coming from somewhere that shouldn't exist. When the image cleared, it revealed a man whose very presence seemed to bend reality around him. His eyes burned with the intensity of dying stars, and when he spoke, his voice carried the fury of solar winds and the cold finality of absolute zero. "This is Commander Jake Morrison of the Terran Shadow Corps," he said, and even through the universal translator, his words carried weight that made the ship's hull vibrate. "We've been watching, we've been waiting, and now we're home." Transformation in Admiral Threx was immediate. His exoskeleton, which had been dim with stress patterns, suddenly blazed with recognition and hope. But that hope was mixed with something else, a deep primal fear that came from racial memory. The Valonians remembered the humans, and they remembered what they were capable of. The transmission shifted to show the space around the swarm fleet. And what the crew saw defied every law of physics they thought they understood. Where moments before there had been empty void, now hung vessels that seemed to devour light itself. They weren't just black, they were an absence of light, so complete that looking at them hurt the eyes. But here's the thing that would have made Einstein weep: these ships moved like living shadows, flowing through space as if the laws of inertia were merely suggestions. They didn't accelerate or decelerate in the traditional sense. They simply existed in one place and then existed in another, as if space itself was reshaping around them. Their weapons, if they could even be called weapons, were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. There were no energy beams, no missile launches, no explosions. Instead, the swarm dreadnoughts simply began to come apart at the molecular level. Their ancient biomechanical forms dissolving into scattered atoms that sparkled like deadly snow. In the void, "Impossible," whispered the ship's science officer, a young Valonian who had studied theoretical physics for most of her life. "You can't just unmake something like that. The energy requirements alone would require the output of a small star." Admiral Threx finished, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "Unless you've learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level, unless you've become something that can rewrite the fundamental forces of the universe." The communication continued, and Commander Morrison's image seemed to look directly at each member of the bridge crew. "The children we left behind have grown strong," he said, and there was something almost paternal in his tone. "But not strong enough. Not yet. So we've come home to handle the pest problem." As if responding to his words, more human ships began to materialize throughout the combat zone. They didn't decloak or drop out of hyperspace. They simply phased into existence as if they'd been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The Void Swarm, these ancient predators that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, began to retreat. Actually retreat. These creatures that had never shown fear, that had consumed entire civilizations without hesitation, were running away like scared children. "The humans," Admiral Threx whispered, his voice filled with equal parts relief and terror. "They've returned." But even as he spoke those words, he knew they weren't quite right. These weren't the humans they remembered. The humans they remembered had been fierce warriors, yes, but they'd still been recognizably human. They'd bled red blood and died from the same things that killed other species. What had just appeared in their space was something far more dangerous. These were humans who had spent 3,000 years becoming something that could make the Void Swarm afraid. They were humans who had sacrificed their humanity to preserve it, and the most terrifying part, this was just the beginning. Want to see how small, consistent improvements can compound into overwhelming advantage over time? Just like how humanity's 3,000-year exile transformed them into an unstoppable force. Discover the incredible power of compounding in our next video, where we'll show you how tiny daily actions build into extraordinary results. Click the end screen now to unlock this life-changing principle that turns ordinary effort into legendary success. In the reconstructed Terran embassy on Nexus Station, the galaxy's most powerful leaders gathered for what would become the most important diplomatic meeting in galactic history. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They were meeting in a building that had been abandoned for 3,000 years. Now, hastily restored with dust covers pulled off furniture that had been waiting for owners who might never return. You know that feeling when you're about to meet someone you haven't seen in years, and you're not sure if they'll still be the same person? Now imagine that feeling multiplied by 3 millennia and an entire species. The assembled delegates represented 47 different civilizations, each more nervous than the last. Chancellor Vextar's crystalline form flickered with anxiety, patterns that painted the walls in shifting hues of worry. General Koreth's bioarmor had automatically activated its defensive protocols, as if his own body was preparing for a fight. Even the normally composed ethereal collective had manifested physical forms for this meeting, something they hadn't done in over a century, but nothing could have prepared them for what walked through those. Embassy Doors Commander Morrison entered the chamber, and immediately the air itself seemed to change. It wasn't just his presence, it was as if reality had to make room for him. His skin held a metallic sheen that caught the light in ways that human skin never should, and when he moved, space seemed to bend around him like he was walking through water instead of air. "You want to know where we went?" he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast chamber without any need for amplification. The universal translators struggled with his words, not because of language barriers, but because his voice carried frequencies that shouldn't exist in normal space. The delegates leaned forward despite themselves. This was the question that had haunted the galaxy for 3,000 years. Where had humanity gone? Why had they left? Most importantly, were they coming back? "We went to war," Morrison continued, and his eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who had seen things that would break lesser minds. "A war that lasted 3,000 years. Not years as you understand, them years measured in dimensions you don't have names for, against enemies that exist in spaces between thoughts." The holographic display behind him flickered to life, and what the delegates saw shattered everything they thought they knew about the laws of physics. The images showed humans walking through the hearts of stars as if they were strolling through a garden, their bodies somehow immune to temperatures that would vaporize entire planets. They watched humans reshaping matter with will alone, turning asteroids into fleets and creating pocket dimensions with casual gestures. But the most disturbing images showed humans battling entities that existed in dimensions beyond counting. These weren't creatures in the traditional sense. They were living manifestations of concepts like entropy, chaos, and the void between realities. And the humans were winning. "The void swarm isn't from our reality," Morrison continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several delegates involuntarily step back. "They're harvesters from the spaces between universes. They move through dimensions like you move through rooms, consuming entire realities and leaving nothing behind but empty space." Ambassador Thrix, his exoskeleton clicking nervously, finally found his voice. "But what did you become?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the room held their breath waiting for the answer. Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "We became apex predators. We became the nightmare that nightmares fear. We became what we needed to be to keep you safe." Think about that for a moment. Humanity had voluntarily transformed itself into something that could hunt entities that existed outside normal reality. They had given up their humanity to preserve humanity itself. It was the ultimate paradox, becoming monsters to protect innocence. "And the cost?" asked Chancellor Vexstar, her voice barely above a whisper. Her crystalline form had gone completely transparent, a sign of deep distress in her species. Morrison's expression softened slightly, and for a moment the delegates could see a shadow of the humans they remembered. "We can never be what we were," he replied, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "We are too far removed from baseline humanity. We experience time differently. We exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. We remember things that haven't happened yet and forget things that occurred yesterday." The silence that followed was deafening. These weren't the humans they remembered. These were beings who had transcended mortality itself, who had become something that could barely be called human anymore. But then Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos stepped forward, her movement fluid and graceful despite the obvious modifications. "To her body?" When she spoke, her voice carried a gentler tone that somehow managed to reach every delegate's heart. "We are still human where it matters most, in our hearts," she said, and suddenly the room felt warmer. "We still dream of home. We still remember the taste of Earth's rain and the sound of human laughter. We still cry when we lose someone we love, and we still choose to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The transformation in the room was immediate. These weren't monsters, they were humans who had sacrificed everything to become the ultimate guardians. They had paid the ultimate price to ensure that the younger races would have a chance to grow and flourish. But the most important question remained unasked. What happened when the ultimate guardians decided that the galaxy was ready to protect itself? Want to discover how small, consistent sacrifices can compound into extraordinary transformations over time? Just like how humanity's 3,000-year commitment created the ultimate protectors. Learn the incredible power of compounding in our next video, where we'll show you how tiny daily investments can build into life-changing results. Click the end screen now to unlock this principle that turns ordinary dedication into legendary success. The final battle didn't take place in normal space. It couldn't. When you're fighting an entity that exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously, conventional battlefields become meaningless. The quantum void between realities became the arena for what would either be the galaxy's salvation or its final chapter. Picture trying to fight a war inside a kaleidoscope while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake. That's the closest analogy to what the younger races witnessed as they watched from their fleets, sensors struggling to comprehend what was happening in spaces that shouldn't exist. The Void Swarm's true form was finally revealed, and it was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. This wasn't a fleet of ships or even a collection of creatures. It was a vast consciousness that fed on the collapse of dimensional barriers. Growing stronger with each consumed universe, think of it as a cosmic parasite that didn't just eat planets or stars, but entire realities. Commander Morrison and his warriors materialized in the quantum void, their forms shifting and changing as they adapted to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They looked like living shadows wrapped in starlight, their human shapes barely recognizable beneath the modifications that allowed them to function in spaces that would instantly annihilate any normal being. But here's what made this battle truly extraordinary. They weren't fighting with weapons in any traditional sense. We're fighting with the fundamental forces of creation itself, weaving reality into weapons that could wound entities existing across 17 different planes of existence. Imagine watching someone grab a handful of time, twist it into a spear, and hurl it at the concept of entropy itself. That's what the younger races witnessed through their quantum links, with their minds struggling to process combat that defied every law of physics they thought they understood. The battle raged across dimensions that had no names and spaces between. Thoughts where the laws of cause and effect became suggestions rather than rules. Morrison and his warriors moved like living equations, their bodies becoming mathematical concepts that could slice through the Void Swarm's consciousness like blades through silk. But the cost was becoming apparent with each passing moment. Every attack, every defensive maneuver, every reality-bending technique was burning away more of their remaining humanity. They were literally sacrificing their existence to save the galaxy, one molecule at a time. You know that moment in every great story where the hero has to make the ultimate sacrifice? This was it, except magnified across an entire species that had already given up everything to become the ultimate guardians. As the battle reached its climax, Morrison's final transmission reached the galaxy, his voice somehow carrying across impossible distances to reach every ship, every world, every consciousness capable of understanding his words. We came from you, and we return to you this gift, a universe where you can grow, explore, and become whatever you choose to be. Remember, us not as we were, but as we chose to become. Remember that when the darkness comes, there are those who will always stand in its path. The words hit the listening races like a physical blow. These weren't just the final words of a dying warrior. They were the last testament of an entire species that had voluntarily transformed itself into something beyond mortal understanding. To protect those they loved, the Void Swarm's death scream echoed across 17 dimensions simultaneously, a sound that made reality itself shudder. Its essence scattered across the quantum foam like smoke in a hurricane. Its consciousness finally destroyed by beings who had learned to exist in the spaces between existence itself. But the humans who had saved them were forever changed, transformed, into something beyond mortal understanding. They had become eternal guardians existing in the spaces between thoughts, watching over a galaxy they could no longer call home in any meaningful sense. In the aftermath, as the young races began to rebuild and expand into the vast cosmos, they carried with them the memory of humanity's ultimate sacrifice. Not just their lives, but their very humanity given. freely so that others might have a chance to find their own path among the stars. The humans had vanished again. They had never truly left. In every act of courage displayed by the younger races, every moment of sacrifice for others, every choice to stand against the darkness, their humanity endured. Immortal and eternal, the guardians who chose to become monsters so that others could remain innocent. The galaxy was safe. The Watchers were watching. Somewhere in the dark between worlds, humanity's children stood ready to answer the call when darkness came again. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story isn't the sacrifice itself, it's what came after. The younger races didn't just survive, they thrived. They grew stronger, braver, more united than ever before. They learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become their own hero. The galaxy would never see humanity in physical form again, but they would feel their presence in every moment of courage, every act of selfless love, every choice to protect the innocent. Humanity had become something eternal. It is species, but an idea. The idea that some things are worth becoming monsters to protect. Want to see how small, consistent acts of courage can compound into legendary impact over time? Just like how humanity's 3,000-year commitment created eternal guardians. Discover the incredible power of compounding in our next video where we'll show you how tiny daily choices can build into extraordinary legacies. Click the end screen now to unlock this life-changing principle that transforms ordinary people into heroes.